I'm not sure quite how, but it's already the middle of December and I am playing some serious catch up in the garden. But it's not too late to be planting your tulips and your spring bulbs even though it's December. Thank goodness. Hey everyone, how's it going and welcome back. Do you ever have one of those jobs where when you're planning it out or you're sitting thinking about it on the sofa, it feels like it's going to be really good fun, and then you go and get the stuff and you're still looking forward to it, but then the next thing is life gets in the way and the job starts getting put off, and the longer it gets put off, the less you feel like doing it, and actually the more it feels like a chore? Well, that's exactly what happened with my bulb planting. If you watched my garden tour and future plans video, it was out in October, I talked about putting in a couple of beds in the orchard here that I was going to plant up with a whole load of bulbs that I bought back at the end of September. Well, that was the middle of October, and guess what? It's now the middle of December. But we've got the perfect day for it. The weather's really nice. It's nice and calm. So let's get stuck in. So here's the plan. The orchard is already filled with loads of lovely spring bulbs. The previous owners filled this area with loads of lovely things like yellow daffodils, white daffodils, bluebells, snowdrops, you name it, it's here. Most of them were planted around the base of each of the apple trees, and some of them have been naturalised into the grass. Earlier on this year, and I did a video about it, I started lifting up a load of them that were in the places that I didn't want them to be so that I could replant them. But I'm going to go one step further and I'm going to create 2 dedicated flower beds in the orchard. I hate the term flower beds, 2 beds in the orchard that are going to be dedicated to things that I want to plant. So the first one is going to go from this apple tree to the one just over here. And the second one, well, the second one is going to be up here, and it's going to be between this tree and the tree behind it. So that's going to give me 2 really large dedicated spaces where I can plant bulbs, and then through the spring and over years add more different plants in so that I've got something really nice and varied here in the orchard. It is lovely, but it is pretty much bare grass other than in the spring. So I'd really like to just give it a bit more pop and a bit more colour and a bit more interest. Let's have a chat about the bulbs that I'm going to be planting. The first thing that I'm planting are tulips, and these are Tulip Queen of Night. Really famous, really well known because they're really dark purple and they're nice and tall. They're about 60 centimetres, so they're going to be really striking here, especially because the garden is quite big. I want something a little bit standout. I've bought a fair few of these. I've bought 80 bulbs. It seemed like a lot at the time, and now that I'm looking at the space that I need to fill, I'm realising there really isn't that many bulbs, but at the same time, I can't blow my entire bank balance on bulbs in one year. What I can do though is put these ones in this year and then over time add some more and add some more. The next things that I'm putting in are these. These are snake's head fritillaries, or Fritillaria Meleagris. I have such a thing about these. They are gorgeous. They're about 20 centimetres high, about 6 or 8 inches, and they have lovely little purple or white bell-shaped flowers. But what's incredible is the markings that are on the flowers. They're almost like a Charles Rennie Mackintosh watercolour painting, little blocks of colour. They look incredible. They look brilliant when they're planted en masse in clumps or in drifts, so I have bought a lot of these. They're not very expensive and you get a lot in a pack, so I've bought 160 of them. That's going to keep me busy planting them. And then the final thing, which I've never grown before, are these. These are anemones and they're called Bordeaux. Again, a lovely dark purple. I think that's going to be really striking. What I'm going for is a kind of purple and white theme, because then as time goes on, I'm going to add in things like foxgloves that will be similar shades, and I think it's going to work really nicely. But let's get on to the contentious issue of when these are meant to be planted. So the easiest ones are tulips. You actually want to be planting them at the back end of the autumn, and the reason for that is that the ground and the air is a little bit colder, and it means that they're less susceptible to catching a fungal disease called tulip fire. So ideally, you want to be doing it in November, but it means that doing it in the middle of December really isn't the end of the world. What is a wee bit different though are the snake's head fritillaries and the Anemones. Ideally, they should have been planted way earlier in the autumn, really around September time. But you know what? I've got the bulbs and I'm going to give them a go. And that brings me on to the main point of this. It is not all lost if you've got bulbs and you haven't planted them yet. So for starters, tulips want to be planted later in this season, but then the other bulbs, it's really not the end of the world. Put them in the ground and see how they get on. Most spring bulbs need a decent length of time in the cold to drive them on so that they start growing and flowering in the spring. The great thing about being in the UK and Ireland is that there is plenty of cold weather until quite late on in the spring, so it's unlikely that even if you plant them late, you're going to have a problem with them. Worst case, they might just flower that little bit later on. The other thing is that now is actually a brilliant time to get some discounts on bulbs, and if you like a bargain, it is definitely the time for that. At this point, bulb growers discount their bulbs really heavily, and what you could actually do, if you like a bit of a bargain hunt, is go online, order a whole load of them now, have them delivered and get them straight into the ground, because it probably won't be too late and you'll still get nice spring flowers. And then the final thing is really just an important point, and it's about waste. If you've already bought bulbs but you haven't got them in the ground, go and put them in the ground. Worst case, they don't work. In all likelihood, they will, even if they flower a little bit late, but most of all, they're not going to waste. If you've got bulbs that are in their packet and they're sitting in the house not doing anything, they're not doing anything. So it's worth a try. And that's why I'm going to be getting on with this today, because although it's late, it's worth a go. So the first thing I need to do is strip off all of this grass. Bear with me, because I could be some time. And boom, the bed's ready to go. Just like that. Only took a few minutes, even had time to get my hair done. Okay, that's obviously not the case. It's actually 2 days later. What I thought was going to take maybe a couple of hours or maybe an afternoon at best has taken me 2 full days of getting soaked, getting muddy, getting tired, getting dispirited, but it's finally ready to go. So let's get some bulbs in. Oh, and by the way, rather than going through everything that I had to do to get this bed ready for this little bit, I'm going to put that in another video coming up next week. Great, so all the preparatory work's done and the bed is ready to go. By the way, if you happen to spot the odd little bit of grass that I've missed or a weed that I haven't lifted, please don't comment down below. This was a lot of work and I did my best, honest. And besides, once I get the bulbs in, this is all getting covered in bark as well, which will help suppress a few weeds, and anything else that comes up over the next few months, I'll just pick out by hand. But let's get on to the bulb planting itself. So I'm planting the 3 different types of bulbs that I talked about earlier: Fritillaria, tulips, and anemones. And what I'm wanting to do is, rather than plant them in clumps, I want them to be planted in big drifts. It'll be higher impact and it'll look nice and natural. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can do that, and it depends on the bulbs that you're using. If you're using big, easy to see bulbs like this, you can actually just scatter them over the soil in the rough drifts that you want, and then you can tweak them around a little bit to change. What I would say, and this is relevant if you're planting bulbs in December, is quite often they've already started to shoot like this. And maybe I'm going over the top, but I don't want to be chucking these around so that they're landing on the soil and potentially damaging these tips. So that's where these come in. These are just petals that I've collected from the garden. They're going to take the brunt of the fall rather than the bulbs. So what I'll do is I'll scatter these around in rough places where I want to have the drifts, and they're going to be where the bulbs are going to go. So I've put a very rough line of bulbs. Actually, they're not bulbs, they're the pebbles. I've put a very rough line of the pebbles, and where each one of those lands, I'm either going to put 1 or 2 of the bulbs. So when I set those down, I can have a quick look, and I'm going to keep going over the whole bed, and then I'm going to see what they look like. And I will do a little bit of tweaking, but the key is not to tweak them too much. Humans are not good at coming up with random patterns, and even when we think we're being random, it doesn't look random, it looks kind of staged. So stick with, when you throw either the bulbs or the pebbles down, where they land as much as possible, and it'll look good. So they're going to be ready to go and ready to plant, and the next thing that I'm putting in are the Fritillaria. Now, these haven't started to shoot, and they're lovely little white bulbs. So when I'm putting them on the soil, I'm just going to directly drop them down. They are going to go into little clumps, and I'm going to be planting them in clumps of 3, 5, 7 or 9. Nice little clumps of odd numbers. They're going to be dotted all around the bed. I don't worry about using pebbles for these. They're not going to get damaged and they show up so easily. And then the final ones are these. These are the Anemone Corms. Now, when you get these from the garden centre or when you order them online, they're generally pretty dried out and desiccated. So what I did earlier on today was I got this jar, filled it with some cold water, and then dropped these in and left them to soak for 3 hours. And you'll be amazed at actually quite how much they plump up. So a bit like the Fritillaries, they're going to go in little clumps. But these things, well, they're basically camouflage with the soil. So I'm going to do the same trick with the pebbles, except I'm using some more gravel that I nicked from elsewhere in the garden, and it's nice sharp white gravel that will stand out as well. So again, I'm going to be scattering that down in small clumps of maybe 5 or 7, because I actually only have about 70 of these bulbs, so I don't have a whole load of them. So I'm going to keep working on this, and you can come back in a minute and then we can start getting them in the soil. So the biggest downside about planting your bulbs in December, well, it's actually nothing to do with the bulb and more to do with the weather. If you live somewhere like I do in Ireland, it rains a lot in the winter, and unless you want to do this job in the chucking rain, you end up actually having to dodge the showers all of the time. And meanwhile, your flower beds and your soil get heavier and claggier and more compacted and muddy. Ugh. But let's keep going. So first top tip is no matter what time you plant your bulbs, even if you're planting them this late in the season, you want to plant them nice and deep. The golden rule is about 3 times their own depth in the soil. Second top tip, it is way better to plant them that little bit too deep than that little bit too shallow. Plant them nice and deep. Even if you plant them too deep, they will still make it to the surface. They know how, and they're going to be grand, and it means that they're nicely anchored in the soil. The flip side of that is if you plant them that little bit too shallow, they have a tendency to push themselves up and out of the soil. And in fact, all around our garden, we do actually have patches of daffodils which have done that, and now they sit very, very close to the surface. What I'm going to have to do later on in the spring is actually dig them up and rebury them even deeper. So let's get planting these. I've got a few nice and handily close to the edge because I don't want to be teetering on a plank or a board while I'm filming this. So I've got a pebble here which marked out where I want one of the bulbs, and I've actually put 2 next to it. I'm using a bulb planter for this because it's really handy to get a nice deep hole for putting these in. Going down with the bulb planter, give it a wiggle, and pull it out, and it pulls out a really nice core of soil. By the way, if you don't have one of these in the garden, these are really cheap to buy and they're really handy, much easier than using a trowel. So then it's just a case of popping your bulb into that hole. Now the one thing I'm going to add is you might notice I've got a bag of horticultural grit. Our soil is pretty clay and it's very wet at the moment, and I don't want the bulbs to rot. I don't think it's absolutely necessary, but just as a little bit of an insurance policy, what I'm doing is tipping a tiny bit of grit into the bottom of each hole, then popping the bulb in. And once it's in, then it's just a case of tipping out the core that this thing has collected and popping it down on top of the bulb, and then repeat. In my case, repeat an awful lot. I've got a lot of bulbs to do. So then the next thing is the Fritillaria. Again, if you think about wanting to plant these about 3 times their own depth, you're really only looking about that much. When I look at the packet, they're actually saying plant them about 10 centimeters deep. So for that, this isn't really going to do the job. And what is easier is just to use a trowel. So I've got my trowel. I've dropped a few of these where I want them to be in a nice little clump. And what I'm going to do is simply lift up an area rather than a specific hole. Cool. So I've got the hole and these just need to go in. But again, I'm going to do the same just as a little bit of an insurance policy. I'm putting a little bit of horticultural grit in just so that they're not sitting really wet and claggy all the way through the winter. I'm hoping that it's going to be a little bit of an insurance policy against these rotting off. So the 3 go in and get covered up with the soil. And then finally, it's onto the anemones. Exactly the same. You're not wanting to plant them too deep, and I'm going to do exactly the same, which is where I want them, I'm going to dig a little shallow trench. Just like that. And then pop these in, again with a little bit of gravel. So here I'm only going to put 3 in. Now, when you're getting anemones, depending on which you get, they're always really funny shapes. Always have a look online about which is the right way to plant them. Whoop, I dropped it. Because they're funny shapes and not like a standard bulb, it can be a wee bit tricky. So I looked up these are Anemone Bordeaux, and the way they need to be planted is with the point down and this tiny little rough patch at the top facing up, because that's where the shoots are going to come from. But the big tip on this is if you look online or if you look at them and you still don't know what to do, don't plant them either way up, plant them on their side. They're clever enough that they know which way is up and which way is down. If you plant them on their side, they're going to be just fine and they're going to come up. So all you need to do is cover those up. And basically, we're done. Or at least you're done. You don't need to do the rest of these. I have another 160 Fritillaria or fritillary bulbs to go. Or well, actually there's 3 less, so there's 157. I've got another 79 tulips to go, and I've got another 72-ish anemone corms to go. I'm going to be quite a while, so enjoy, and at least enjoy not having to do it while I do it. So hopefully you found this useful, and not only useful, but reassuring as well. Reassuring that if you've got bulbs in your house that you haven't done anything with yet, it is not too late. Get yourself and your bulbs out into the garden, get them planted, and you're almost guaranteed to have some kind of spring display that's going to make it worth your while. Particularly with tulips, they're going to be absolutely fine. Or if you haven't actually bought bulbs yet, have a look online, have a look in your garden centre and see if you can nab yourself a bargain before Christmas, get them in, and you'll have a spring display as well. I'm going to keep working away here. Bearing in mind my current form this week on working on this, I'm not going to say it's going to take me the rest of the afternoon. I think it's going to take me another few days, but it's going to be worth it. So, as ever, if you enjoyed this, let me know by leaving a comment down below and hit the like button. If you haven't already, subscribe and make sure to hit the bell icon, because that way you'll be notified when I upload my next video. And until next time, see you later.